What if the most powerful king of England was already half dead long before his body finally gave out? That is the shadow which hangs over Henry VIII. In textbooks, he is introduced with shorthand simplicity, the king with 6 wives, the man who broke from Rome to form the Church of England, the monarch whose reign reshaped religion and power in Europe. But that neat summary disguises a far darker truth. Behind the pageantry and political triumphs stood a man whose body was collapsing into corruption and whose mind sank into paranoia, so consuming it warped an entire kingdom. Henry's image has always been split between 2 extremes. On one side, he is remembered as the vibrant young prince of 1509, athletic, charming, skilled in music and sport, admired across Europe. On the other, and the later Henry, is painted as grotesque, swollen to 400 pounds, his body leaking pus, his temper boiling into cruelty. These are not 2 different men, but 2 ends of the same life, bound together by tragedy, obsession, and power without restraint. This story does not begin with the 6 queens who cycled through his bed and scaffold. It begins with the man himself, a monarch whose body became his own prison by the end of his reign. Henry was not a symbol of glory, but of ruin, staggering through palaces designed to dazzle Europe while leaving trails of rotting flesh behind him. Chroniclers record whispers of courtiers holding perfumed cloths to their faces when they entered his presence. Diplomats wrote to their masters in shock at the stench and the sight of a king who seemed both godlike in power and monstrous in form. And yet, for all his physical collapse, Henry VIII clung to his throne with iron grip. His decisions toppled dynasties, reshaped faith, and cost the lives of queens, friends, servants, and innocents. The story of his wives is famous. Less well known is how the king's own body mirrored the disintegration of his rule, how each ulcer and each convulsion reflected the breakdown of his mind and kingdom. To understand this transformation, one must first strip away the polished myths of Tudor nostalgia, the banquets, the tapestries, the glitter of the field, of the cloth of gold. So beneath that surface lies a tale closer to nightmare than romance. The merry monarch was a walking corpse whose paranoia drenched his court in blood. And we begin with the most intimate battlefield, Henry's flesh. The monarch who once dazzled Europe as the perfect Renaissance prince lived long enough to become a horror to those who served him. His body was not merely failing. It seemed to revolt against him, turning the figure of majesty into a grotesque parody of power. And so, the opening question remains: what happens when a man who believes himself chosen by God cannot control his own decaying frame? The answer lies in the ulcers, the swelling, and the stench that haunted the last decade of his reign. The story of Henry's downfall begins not with politics, but with the rebellion of his body. And next, we turn to the collapse of that body, an anatomy of suffering that shocked even hardened Tudor servants. By the final years of his reign, Henry VIII's body was no longer a king's temple, but a battlefield of decay. Records describe him with a waist measuring 54 inches larger than the average Tudor man was tall, and his weight approached 400 pounds, nearly triple that of the ordinary English subject, who might weigh 140 at best. The man who once jousted in shining armor now had to be hoisted onto horseback with mechanical contraptions. But obesity was only the surface. His legs, the very limbs that had once carried him through tournaments and hunts, were ravaged by ulcers so severe that chroniclers could hardly bring themselves to write of them. These were not small sores, but gaping wounds that oozed continuously. The smell of rotting flesh clung to the king wherever he went. Servants gagged, courtiers pressed perfumed handkerchiefs to their noses, and foreign ambassadors reported the stench in horrified detail. It was said the odour carried through several rooms, a ghostly herald of the king's approach. Those who dressed him drew lots to decide who would endure the ordeal. The unlucky winner was forced to kneel before the infected legs, bandage the sores, and endure the nauseating reek of pus and decay. For these attendants, it was not service but punishment. Modern physicians, reading the reports centuries later, have speculated about the causes. Many point to untreated diabetes. There's too syphilis, though evidence is scarce. Still others suspect Cushing's syndrome, a hormonal disorder that explains both the bloating and the unhealed wounds. All agree on one thing: Henry's flesh was in rebellion, and there was nothing his doctors dared to do about it. For Tudor medicine was a strange mixture of superstition and fear. Physicians believed that disease arose from imbalances in the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Treatments often involved bleeding or purging, remedies that may have worsened Henry's condition. And while any ordinary patient might suffer misdiagnosis, Henry's attendants lived under an added terror. To speak too plainly about the king's failing health was treason. A doctor's candour could end in the Tower. Thus the king, whose very breath carried the smell of corruption, was told little but what he wished to hear. His body swelled, his wounds festered, and his court learned to keep silent. This grotesque decline stood in cruel contrast to his youth. In the early years, Henry was famed for his strength and beauty. He was tall, muscular, red-haired, praised as the very embodiment of the Renaissance prince. Ambassadors compared him to Apollo or Mars, and to watch that figure collapse into immobility, crippled by his own body, must have seemed not merely tragic, but uncanny, as if divine favour had turned to divine punishment. And still, even this account of disease does not explain the darkest change of all, for Henry's body was not the only thing that broke in his lifetime. His mind, too, would fracture after a single moment in 1536, when a jousting accident hurled England's king from vitality into paranoia. The rebellion of his flesh prepared the stage. The rebellion of his mind would turn Henry VIII from prince to tyrant. On a January day in 1536, the tilt yard thundered with hooves and the crash of lances. Jousting was not mere sport for Tudor kings, it was theatre of power. To sit astride a war horse in full armour, to lower the lance and shatter it in a glorious collision, was to proclaim virility, courage, and divine favour. For Henry VIII, who had spent his youth dazzling Europe with his athleticism, the lists were his stage. But on this day, Bet struck him harder than any opponent. Henry's horse fell, pinning him to the ground, and the great king lay motionless, his armour dented, his body limp. For 2 long hours he was unconscious, and in Tudor medicine, such silence was as close to death as one could come without burial. Courtiers whispered prayers. Some thought the king's soul had departed. When he finally stirred, the miracle of his survival masked a darker truth. The Henry who rose was not the Henry who had fallen. Modern physicians, reading the accounts, suspect traumatic brain injury. Concussion alone would have been dangerous, but 2 hours without waking suggests severe damage. And the symptoms that followed fit the pattern: violent mood swings, bursts of paranoia, irrational cruelty, and obsessions that no counsellor could soothe. Before 1536, Henry was remembered even by enemies as generous, musical, and energetic. Afterward, his reign darkened. Incisions grew harsher, punishment swifter, trust rarer, and the young Renaissance prince hardened into a tyrant who trusted no one, not even his wives. The timing was cruel. Just days after the accident, Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, died, and Boleyn, his second, miscarried a son. To a mind already bruised, these events seemed like cosmic betrayal. From this crucible of injury and grief emerged the Henry history remembers unpredictable, paranoid, and hungry for absolute control. The joust, once the symbol of his virility, had instead shattered his identity. Where he once sought glory in the lists, he now demanded it in surveillance, executions, and displays of dominance. The court, once a theatre of music and dance, became a place of whispers and dread. The chroniclers of the time noticed the shift. Ambassadors recorded that the king's temper was now uncontrollable. One moment he embraced courtiers with lavish affection, the next he thundered threats of death. His decisions no longer followed reason but impulse, as though the crown had become hostage to his broken skull. And yet none could speak it, and to suggest the king was impaired was treason. Dead, courtiers invented explanations: divine wrath, melancholy, or witchcraft. But in truth, the crown of England was now balanced on the mind of a man forever changed. This accident marked the turning point, and the Henry, who once laughed with musicians and debated theology as a scholar, now gave way to the Henry who stalked his wives with suspicion, orchestrated false trials, and demanded obedience as proof of loyalty. The Tiltyard had written a new story. England would pay the price. From the joust came paranoia, and from paranoia came cruelty. The first to suffer were those closest to him, his queens, and everyone knows the rhyme: divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. It reduces 6 lives to a schoolyard chant, yet behind the rhythm lies a sequence of human tragedies that no rhyme can contain. Each woman who became Henry's queen stepped not into splendor, but into a gilded cage, her fate bound to the king's shifting temper and his desperate obsession with securing a male heir. Marriage in Tudor England was never a private matter. For Henry, it was a political weapon, spiritual test, and men increasingly a battlefield. Queens were meant to embody fertility and loyalty, but in his court, failure or even the suspicion of failure meant ruin, divorce, annulment, or the scaffold waited at the edge of every marriage bed. Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr, 6 women, each brought to the throne with promises of glory, each reduced by Henry's will to humiliation, terror, or death. For them, queenship was not privilege but endurance. Henry's obsession was simple and unyielding. He needed a son. Dynastic stability demanded it. Without a male heir, and the Tudor throne still young and insecure after the Wars of the Roses, was vulnerable. And so, with each marriage, and the stakes rose higher, more wives became pawns in the game of succession, and their wombs were measured not in love, but in heirs, their loyalty tested not by devotion, but by obedience to a mercurial king. Yet Henry's tyranny extended far beyond the question of children. He played psychological games as cruel as any executioner's axe. One day, he lavished his queen with jewels and praise. The next, he ignored her or accused her of betrayal. In public, he staged affection. In private, he prepared charges. Queens could never know whether a banquet meant security or whether it was the last meal before the Tower. Court life became a theatre of dread. Every smile from the king might be a mask, every gift a trap, and the queens lived in rooms adorned with tapestries and gold. There beneath the splendor lay silence, fear, and isolation. Divorce was almost impossible, escape unthinkable, and to resist was to invite death not only for themselves, but for their families. for Henry's wrath spread outward, consuming brothers, servants, and even friends of the accused. It was not only their bodies that were bound, but their reputations. When Henry turned against a queen, rumors spread like wildfire, whispers of adultery, witchcraft, madness. The women were reduced to caricatures, their dignity stripped in public trials orchestrated to secure their fall. These 6 women illustrate the paradox of Tudor queenship under Henry, elevated above all others, yet utterly powerless. Their crowns were circlets of thorns, and the rhyme makes it sound simple, but each fate hides layers of cruelty, and to understand the true nightmare of Henry's reign, you must follow these queens into their prisons of flesh and fear, beginning with Anne Boleyn, the woman whose brilliance and ambition ended in a scaffold stained with her brother's blood. Anne Boleyn is often remembered as the woman who changed the fate of England, the spark behind Henry's break with Rome, the queen whose dark eyes and sharp wit pulled a king into defiance of the Pope. Yet her story ends not in triumph, but in the Tower, where Henry transformed a woman he once adored into a scapegoat for his fury and insecurity. When Anne first entered Henry's court, she was unlike the women he had known. Educated in the courts of Burgundy and France, she brought with her a refinement, a confidence, and a charm that bewitched the king. Unlike her sister, Mary Henry's earlier mistress, Anne, refused to be merely a passing fancy. She held out, demanded marriage, and in doing so altered the course of history. Henry's determination to make her queen tore England from the Catholic Church, ignited religious upheaval, and cost Catherine of Aragon her crown. For a time, Anne was the center of the Tudor universe, but the crown she won was poisoned. Her failure to produce a living son placed her in peril. She bore Elizabeth, a daughter of extraordinary destiny, but in Henry's eyes, a disappointment. As carriages followed, each one tightening the noose. By 1536, the king's affection had curdled into suspicion. The jousting accident had already darkened his moods, and Anne's sharp tongue and political influence made her enemies at court. Where once she was his obsession, now she was an obstacle. Henry's solution was as brutal as it was calculated. He would destroy her utterly. Accusations were fabricated. Her own musician, Mark Smeaton, was tortured until he confessed to adultery. 5 men, including her own brother, George Boleyn, were condemned for alleged affairs with the Queen. The charges stretched into the absurd, with dates and places that were physically impossible, yet the trials were a formality. The verdict had been written before the proceedings began. Anne was forced to witness the execution of these men from the Tower. Imagine her standing there, knowing each axe stroke was not only a death sentence for her friends, but also a rehearsal for her own. To see her brother's life taken in a spectacle of state cruelty was the final act of psychological torture. Her own trial was a theatre of humiliation. She stood accused of treason, incest, adultery, crimes designed to strip her not only of life, but of dignity. Though she defended herself with eloquence, her words meant nothing. The court knew its duty. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn knelt on the scaffold within the Tower of London, unlike those executed by axe. Henry had arranged for a French swordsman an eerie gesture of mercy amid cruelty. Contemporary accounts describe her final composure. She prayed. She commended herself to God. She asked the crowd to pray for the king, the man who had brought her from coronation to execution. In just 3 years, the blade fell cleanly. Anne's fall was not just personal tragedy, it was a warning. No queen was safe, no affection secure, no crown more than a borrowed ornament from Henry's hand. Her death marked a turning point in his reign, the end of the idealistic prince who once loved passionately, and the beginning of the tyrant who consumed his queens as ruthlessly as his feasts. But Anne's story was not the last. Henry's hunger for youth and beauty would soon reach for Catherine Howard, a teenager thrown into a court where desire and terror danced hand in hand. If Anne Boleyn's downfall was a drama of ambition and politics, Catherine Howard's tragedy was far starker, a girl barely out of childhood thrust into a world of predators. When Henry married her in 1540, he was nearly 50, crippled by ulcers and obesity. She was no more than 17, radiant, naive, and unprepared for the suffocating weight of a crown. To the aging king, Catherine seemed a vision of rebirth. She called him her rose without a thorn, a phrase that delighted Henry and soothed his vanity. In her youth and beauty, he saw a balm for his decaying body. For a time, the court sparkled again, with feasts, music, and the laughter of a king who fancied himself once more a gallant lover. But beneath the pageantry lay danger, as Catherine's past, trivial by ordinary standards, became fatal under Henry's gaze. Before her marriage, she had formed youthful attachments, flirtations, perhaps affairs with men in the household of her guardian, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, as in the world of Tudor politics. Such things were whispered but not unusual. Yet in Henry's court, they became weapons. When her former acquaintances spoke of her past, the king's fragile pride snapped. Henry's response was not only execution but legislation. In 1541, Parliament passed a law declaring it treason for a queen to conceal any premarital sexual history from the king. Imagine the scale of the humiliation, an entire legal code rewritten to punish a teenager's honesty. It was less law than vengeance, a monument to Henry's insecurity. The process of Catherine's destruction followed the familiar Tudor pattern: isolation, interrogation, confession under duress. She was stripped of her jewels, her friends dismissed, her letters seized. Witnesses were questioned, and the details of her youthful indiscretions were magnified into treason. She was scarcely more than a child, yet the machinery of the state ground forward as if she were a conspirator plotting against the realm. On the morning of February 13, 1542, Catherine Howard was led to the scaffold on Tower Green, the same place where Anne Boleyn had met her end. Chroniclers say she was trembling but resolute. Before her death, she asked for mercy and prayed for forgiveness. The executioner's axe struck, and the girl who had once danced in Henry's halls was gone. Her death exposed the starkest truth of Henry's marriages, that queens were not wives, but captives. Catherine's crown had been a cage gilded with jewels, her beauty transformed from blessing to death sentence. And while Catherine Howard's blood was still drying on the scaffold, another memory haunted the court: Catherine of Aragon, the first queen, the loyal wife cast aside. Her story was less sudden, but no less cruel: a slow, suffocating exile that ended in loneliness and whispered rumors of poison. Long before Anne Boleyn or Catherine Howard, there was Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess who became Henry's first queen and reigned beside him for over 20 years. She had been married first to Henry's elder brother, Arthur, but his death left her a widow in a foreign land, and to preserve the alliance with Spain, she was wed to Henry, who in their early years had treated her with respect and affection, and together they appeared the perfect Renaissance couple, young, devout, and admired across Europe. Yet Catherine's reign was shadowed by misfortune. She endured repeated pregnancies, most ending in stillbirths or infant deaths. Only one child, a daughter named Mary, survived. However, Henry got obsessed with securing a male heir. This was failure, though for Catherine, deeply pious and bound by her vows, and it was heartbreak after heartbreak. Each cradle that stood empty pushed her further into Henry's disfavor. By the 1520s, Henry's eye had turned to Anne Boleyn, and with it came his determination to end his marriage. The king claimed that marrying his brother's widow had cursed their union, citing biblical verses to prove his point. But behind the theology lay a simpler motive: he wanted a son, and Catherine, in his view, could not provide one. The battle that followed shook Christendom. Catherine refused to yield, declaring herself the true queen before courts and ambassadors. She appealed to the Pope, drawing in Spain and Rome against Henry's will. The king, frustrated by papal resistance, tore England from the Catholic Church, declaring himself supreme head. Catherine's refusal to surrender her crown became the spark that ignited the English Reformation. But in victory, Henry showed no ceci. Catherine was banished from court, stripped of her title, and sent to live in isolation. Mother and daughter were torn apart. Princess Mary was forbidden from visiting her mother, forced instead to acknowledge Anne Boleyn as queen. Catherine wrote letters pleading for reunion, but Henry never read them. She lived her final years at Kimbolton Castle, a prisoner in all but name. Witnesses describe her as frail but resolute, clinging to her faith and signing letters as Catherine the Queen until the end. On January the 7th, 1536, she died, likely of cancer. Though rumours whispered of poison, she was 50 years old. Even in death, Henry's cruelty lingered. Catherine was buried not in Westminster Abbey, where queens were traditionally honoured, but in Peterborough Cathedral, with the lesser title of Dowager Princess of Wales. Her daughter Mary was barred from attending the funeral. Catherine of Aragon's story is not one of sudden violence, like Anne Boleyn's or Catherine Howard's, but of a slow suffocation death by exile, humiliation, and enforced solitude. She had once been Europe's most admired queen, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. Yet in Henry's England she ended her days alone, her crown broken, but her dignity intact. And if Catherine of Aragon's fate was slow erosion, Anne of Cleves's was survival through submission. She escaped Henry's wrath not by defiance, but by bowing so completely that she turned annulment into an unlikely kind of freedom. After the blood-stained downfall of Anne Boleyn and the slow death of Catherine of Aragon, the story of Anne of Cleves seems almost miraculous. She was the queen who outlived Henry, not by his love, but by his indifference and her ability to bow when others resisted. In 1539, Henry sought a new alliance. The Reformation had left England isolated, and a marriage into the Protestant German states promised security. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's minister, arranged a match with Anne, sister to the Duke of Cleves. Portraits were exchanged, the most famous painted by Hans Holbein. In it, Anne appears serene, composed, and elegant. Henry, pleased by the likeness, agreed to marry her, but portraits, even in the Renaissance, could flatter. When Anne arrived in England, Henry was disappointed, and he claimed she was nothing like the picture, that her body and bearing failed to please him. Accounts suggest she was shy, unused to English customs, and overwhelmed by the theatrical court. Henry, once inflamed by Anne Boleyn's boldness, found Anne of Cleves too plain, too foreign, too dull. He mocked her as the Flanders mare. Their marriage, solemnized in January 1540, was doomed before it began. Henry confided that he could not consummate it, blaming her looks, though whispers suggested his own failing body was the greater obstacle. Within months, the king was desperate to be rid of her. Here lay Anne's genius, and like Catherine of Aragon, who fought to the end, Anne yielded completely, and when Henry demanded annulment, she agreed without resistance. She declared herself grateful to be released, signed away her marriage, and addressed Henry as her dear brother. Instead of the scaffold, she received estates, a generous income, and a new title, the King's Sister. Anne of Cleves remained in England for the rest of her life, a curious figure in the Tudor court, respected, wealthy, but carefully invisible. She outlived Henry and all of his other wives, dying in 1557, the quiet survivor of a king who destroyed nearly everyone close to him. Her escape revealed the twisted logic of Henry's court submission. Even humiliation could mean life, while defiance meant death. Anne of Cleves had no power to command Henry's love, but she had the wisdom to bend rather than break. Yet not all queens were given that chance. Jane Seymour, the woman who followed Anne of Cleves, found her place in Henry's heart only by giving him the one thing he desired most, but the price was her life. Jane Seymour is often called the only wife Henry truly loved. Yet her story is a cruel irony. The Queen remembered, as lucky was the one who died young, her body broken in childbirth, her worth measured by the son she delivered. Jane came to Henry's notice as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Anne Boleyn, where Anne was sharp-tongued and dazzling. Jane was quiet, modest, and deferential, the perfect antidote to the fiery queen Henry had grown to resent. Chroniclers say she knew how to soothe him, how to flatter his pride without provoking his temper. Within weeks of Anne Boleyn's execution in May 1536, Henry was betrothed to Jane. 11 days later, she was queen. Her reign lasted little more than a year, yet in that time she achieved what no wife before her could. She gave Henry a legitimate son. On October 12, 1537, Jane delivered Edward, the long-awaited male heir. Bells rang across England. Bonfires lit the night. For Henry, it was the culmination of decades of longing and the justification for every broken marriage and severed head. But Jane's triumph was short-lived. The birth was grueling, lasting more than 2 days. Within 12 days, she was dead, likely of puerperal fever, an infection common in an age without knowledge of hygiene. She was around 29 years old. Henry's grief was genuine, at least by his standards. He wore black for 3 months, longer than he had mourned anyone else. He called Jane his true wife, the only one who had given him what he most desired. In death, she became sanctified, the queen who succeeded where all others failed. Henry ordered that when his own time came, he be buried beside her, a wish that was carried out. Yet Jane's victory was hollow. Her life was consumed by the burden of childbirth, her identity erased in service to Henry's obsession with a male heir. She left behind no chance to shape policy, no legacy beyond Edward VI, the frail boy who would reign only 6 years before his death. The image of Jane as the gentle consort lingers in Tudor memory, but it is less truth than projection. She was the vessel who delivered a prince, and for that, Henry enshrined her as his one true queen. To call her the lucky one is to mistake survival for fortune. Her luck was simply that she did not live long enough to fall from Henry's favor. If Jane's death sealed her place as Henry's beloved, the next chapter returned to cruelty. With Anne of Cleves, Henry's appetite for alliance had turned sour, but with Catherine Howard, his hunger for youth and passion reignited and ended, once more, in blood. And if Henry VIII's marriages revealed the cruelty of his heart, his table revealed the ruin of his body. No king in Europe ate with such abandon, and no royal appetite left behind such grotesque consequences. Chroniclers estimate Henry consumed around 5,000 calories a day, more than double what even an active Tudor man required. And Henry, in his later years, was anything but active. Where once he had hunted and jousted, he now hobbled with difficulty, borne about on chairs and pulleys. Yet the feasting never ceased. A single meal might include whole roasted pigs and several chickens, mountains of bread, dishes of eel and pike, venison pies heavy with spice, and flagons of wine enough to drown his ailments for a night. His court kitchens, brawling beneath Whitehall and Hampton Court, employed more than 200 cooks, butchers, bakers, and servers. Over 800 dishes were prepared daily for the royal household. Henry himself would sample dozens, as though the sheer variety could stave off decay. Food was more than sustenance, it was theatre. Banquets were staged as performances of power. Courtiers watched as the king, swollen and stinking from his ulcers, presided over tables that groaned with meat and sugar. To eat like a king was to display wealth. But Henry's appetite went beyond symbolism. It became obsession. He believed certain foods carried powers. Swans were said to grant grace. Venison, the strength of a hunter. Oysters, the potency of virility. He gorged on these with ritual zeal, as though they could restore the vigor lost to age and injury. The court humored him, but in truth, the king was enslaved to superstition as much as to hunger, or was eating a private act. Wars could last 4 hours, with musicians playing and courtiers watching, as Henry tore at meat and sipped from goblets of wine. Every bite had to be tasted first by servants to check for poison. But Henry's paranoia extended the ritual further. He required the tasters to wait half an hour before he would touch the dish, in case the poison worked slowly. Thus the king's table became a slow-motion play of fear, extravagance, and the grotesque indulgence. Ironically, the simplest foods, turnips, barley, coarse bread, were banned from his table. Such fare was for peasants, beneath the dignity of a monarch. Yet these were the very foods that might have spared him ulcers, obesity, and early decay. Instead, Henry's diet, rich in meat and sugar, hastened the collapse of his body. Still he ate, still he drank, convinced that his crown placed him beyond mortal limits. But no banquet could shield him from truth. His body was rotting, and his meals were feeding the corruption. What began at the table extended through the palace. If Henry feared poison in his food, he feared betrayal everywhere. His paranoia, born of pain and power, soon consumed not only his meals, but his entire court. If Henry's appetite was monstrous, his fear of poison was greater still. Every meal became a ritual of suspicion, every dish a potential weapon. No morsel touched his lips until others had risked their lives first. The system was elaborate. Servants known as tasters sampled each plate in view of the court, but Henry, never satisfied, ordered them to wait sometimes 30 minutes or more to see if they collapsed before he dared to eat. Imagine the spectacle. Courtiers watching a servant chew and swallow, the room holding its breath, and the king's eyes fixed on the clock. Only when enough time had passed would Henry lift his fork, and even the kitchens became fortresses. Guards were stationed at the doors, ensuring no outsider could slip poison into the pots. Ingredients were tested separately: the salt, the spices, the water. Each step in the preparation was watched by multiple eyes, though feeding the king were a military operation. And still, Henry was not satisfied. He banned common foods from his table, not for health, but for status. Barley, oats, and root vegetables were forbidden. They were the fare of peasants. And Henry would not be seen lowering himself to such simplicity. He gorged instead on meats, pies, and sugar confections, even as his ulcers worsened and his weight crushed his failing legs. This paranoia extended beyond food, and his court was threaded with spies who reported whispers from the kitchens as readily as from the council chambers. A servant who lingered too long near a wine jug might find himself interrogated. Rumours of plots were enough to spark arrests. The result was a chilling atmosphere at court, where even cooks lived in fear, where tasting the king's meal could mean life or death, and where dining with Henry felt less like feasting than surviving a trial. And the king's table mirrored his soul, lavish in display, hollow with dread. For Henry trusted nothing, not his wives, not his children, not his servants, not even the bread on his plate. This hunger for control, this obsession with betrayal, would seep out from the kitchens into every corridor of power. Soon, the entire palace became a prison of fear, where walls held peepholes, chambers hid secret passages, and every man spied on his neighbour. By the final decade of his reign, Henry VIII had transformed his palaces into labyrinths of suspicion. They were no longer centres of Renaissance brilliance, but fortresses of dread, where every glance might be a betrayal, and every whisper a death sentence. He began with his own chambers. Henry slept with crossbows and pistols near at hand, daggers under his pillow, guards stationed inside the bedchamber itself. He found the one refuge of kings had become dangerous, as he trusted no lock, no servant, no silence. Chroniclers say he would wake in terror, demanding torches be lit to check for assassins. The architecture of fear spread outward. Secret passages wound through his palaces, not for romance or convenience, but for the flight, if blades came for him. Henry could vanish into hidden doors and twisting corridors. Peepholes were carved into walls so he could observe courtiers unseen. And meeting rooms, hidden spaces, allowed eavesdroppers to report every murmur. The court became a stage where the king was both actor and unseen audience, judging every line. And yet, it was not enough. Henry created a network of spies so entangled that even the informants were spied upon. Doubles whispered to servants. Servants betrayed masters, and no one knew which words might be repeated in a council chamber or twisted into evidence at the tower. The line between loyalty and treachery dissolved, until silence itself became the safest language. Paranoia touched every ritual. Meals, already guarded by food tasters and sealed kitchens, were overseen by armed watchmen. Documents were locked and relocked. Letters were opened before they reached their recipients, and even his children were not spared. Princess Mary and the young Elizabeth were monitored as though they plotted rebellion. Though they were only girls, the Tower of London swelled with prisoners whose crime was little more than proximity, a careless jest, a poorly timed sigh. Even a dream reported by an enemy could mean chains. For Henry's paranoia grew so warped that he punished imagined crimes executions for treason not yet committed, for plots never spoken aloud. The contagion spread. Courtiers began to police themselves, anticipating the king's suspicions before he voiced them, meant denounce rivals to prove loyalty. Women watched their words as carefully as their gowns. Fear became the currency of court life, traded in whispers and glances, until truth itself had no value. What had begun with one man's injury and suspicion had metastasized into an entire political system. Henry's paranoia was not private madness, it was national policy. England itself was ruled by fear, and his monarch no longer trusted the ground beneath his feet. But if paranoia infected the living court, its consequences would not end with life. When Henry finally died, his decay was so advanced that even death could not contain him. The terror of his body, once confined to the palace, spilled into the world in a spectacle that horrified all who witnessed it. If Henry feared betrayal from courtiers, he feared it doubly from his own blood. at his daughters. Beatrice and Elizabeth were not simply children in his eyes, but potential conspirators. Shadows cast by their mothers' disgraced crowns. In his paranoia, he imagined treason in the play of girls. Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, bore the deepest wound. Once cherished as Henry's heir, she was declared illegitimate after her mother's exile. Forced to serve as a lady-in-waiting to the infant Elizabeth, she endured humiliation that cut sharper than chains. Letters she wrote to her father pleading for reconciliation went unanswered. Spies hovered around her, reporting her every word, ensuring that even a whisper of resistance reached the king's ears. Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, fared little better. Her mother's execution marked her as tainted, and though Henry later restored her place in succession, she too lived under constant surveillance. The court remembered her mother's sharp tongue and feared that Elizabeth might inherit both her wit and her ambition. Gaian shadowed her. Servants repeated her conversations, and at times even her lessons were sifted for hints of treason. The boy Henry had longed for, Edward, was born of Jane Seymour and raised with the highest hopes, yet even he was not beyond suspicion. Frail, sickly, and protected by a web of attendants, he too was caught in the machinery of watchfulness. His father's paranoia seeped into the nursery, where every cough and whisper was recorded, every tutor scrutinized for loyalty. Thus Henry's children, heirs to a kingdom, grew up in a world where love was poisoned by fear, and to please their father was survival. To disappoint him could mean ruin, and the lessons of suspicion branded themselves into their characters, and Mary would one day rule with severity, haunted by betrayal. Elizabeth would master caution and deception, shaping herself into a queen who revealed only what she wished to be seen. Even Edward, who reigned briefly, inherited a court divided by suspicion, the fruit of his father's endless mistrust. Henry's paranoia was a contagion that infected his dynasty. His obsession with control ensured that his children were not nurtured but monitored, not embraced but interrogated. The very heirs he sought to protect were shaped in the crucible of his fear, and fear did not stop with them. For Henry's paranoia grew so twisted that he began punishing crimes before they were committed, condemning men and women for treason that existed only in his imagination. Henry VIII's court became a place where men and women could die not for what they had done, but for what the king dreamed they might do. In his later years, paranoia had eroded the line between suspicion and judgment, between rumor and sentence. Treason was no longer an act, it was a possibility, and in Henry's England, possibility was fatal. Chroniclers tell of men summoned to the Tower not because of any proven plot, but because the king had seen them in a dream, or because a whisper reached his ear that they might turn against him in time. The machinery of execution moved forward with no more than a hint, while to Henry, preemptive death was safer than trust. The Tower of London filled with prisoners caught in this madness. Nor was it perfumed monarchs. Servants none were immune. Some were accused of harboring disloyal thoughts, others of merely being too close to someone who had fallen from favor. Testimony was twisted, confessions forced, evidence fabricated. Yet the outcome was the same, the axe or the noose, with little more than the king's fear as justification. The treason laws, already harsh, expanded into weapons of paranoia. A parliament passed acts declaring that words alone, casual remarks, careless jokes could be punishable by death. Silence was not safety, for failing to denounce a suspected traitor could itself be treason. In such a world, neighbors became informants, friends became threats, and survival meant constant vigilance. Henry's power to punish the future bred a court of ghosts. They son walked the corridors smiling, but their eyes betrayed terror. Every feast, every council, every whispered conversation carried the taste of dread. No one knew when suspicion might strike, or who might be the next victim of the king's imagination. The chilling result was a society where truth itself lost meaning. Loyalty was measured not in service, but in performance. Lavish displays of devotion, extravagant affirmations of the king's greatness. To hesitate was dangerous. To remain silent and listen to you. Henry demanded not only obedience, but constant proof of it, extracted in words and gestures that masked fear with feigned adoration. This reign of imagined crimes reached its peak in Henry's final years, when his mind, weakened by injury and disease, blurred reality into delusion. The king, who once embodied Renaissance vigor, had become a monarch who ruled by nightmares, condemning shadows as though they were flesh. Yet even this terror could not eclipse the grotesque reality of Henry's own body. For while he punished men for crimes not yet committed, his own flesh was collapsing into decay. The tyrant who executed others for imagined betrayals was himself betrayed by his festering wounds, his failing organs, and the stench that heralded his presence. By the last years of his reign, Henry VIII was no longer a monarch striding through palaces, but a wreck of a man carried like cargo. Trained to move him in specially built chairs with pulleys and wheels, contraptions designed to haul a body that had grown too heavy to stand. He once dazzled Europe as a prince of strength. Now he required machinery to shift from chamber to chamber. The ulcers on his legs had become cavernous, constantly seeping pus and blood. Chroniclers speak of servants following behind with cloths to catch what dripped or fell as the king was moved. Chunks of dead flesh sloughed away from his body, leaving trails that turned royal corridors into grim reminders of decay. The stench was unbearable, so strong that courtiers kept herbs, perfumes, and handkerchiefs at hand to mask it, though none could fully banish the odor of death that clung to him in Tudor medicine. Such sores were treated with poultices, cauterization, or leeches. None brought relief. Some physicians suspected the wounds were punishment from God, and others whispered, never aloud, that the king's own excesses had rotted him from within. Yet no doctor dared speak truth to the sovereign who could send a man to the tower for a misplaced word. They bled him, bandaged him, prayed for him, but did nothing that might halt the relentless advance of corruption. His bulk made even basic movement perilous. Walking was nearly impossible. Standing left him gasping. Royal attendants carried chamber pots wherever he went, for he could not control his bowels. The man who once rode in armor now lived imprisoned by his own body, a prisoner no one dared free, and yet Henry clung to ceremony, and he still presided over councils, still demanded banquets, still wore the robes of majesty, but behind the brocade and jewels was a body collapsing into ruin, a grotesque parody of kingship. Courtiers forced to bow before him, bent not to majesty, but to a swollen, reeking figure whose presence inspired dread rather than reverence. The symbolism was inescapable. Henry's body was England in miniature, bloated by greed, poisoned by fear, and festering from wounds that would not heal. The monarch who had reshaped a church and executed queens was undone not by rebellion or war, but by his own flesh one night, and the worst was yet to come. For if Henry's body was horrifying in life, it became an abomination in death. When he finally succumbed, the corruption within him burst forth, unleashing a spectacle so grotesque that even hardened Tudor servants recoiled. January 1547. The king, who once embodied Renaissance magnificence, lay bloated and gasping, his body stretched and swollen beyond recognition. Servants stood at a distance, not daring to come near unless commanded. For even in his last hours, Henry VIII inspired more fear than pity. His skin, taut and shiny with fluid, gave the impression of a corpse before life had even fled. The air of his chamber was thick with the odor of infection. Accounts describe doctors unable to endure the sight and smell. Some are hardened by years of treating plague and battlefield wounds, vomited and fled the chamber. Yet none dared admit defeat. To declare the king dying was treason, to withhold hope was dangerous. They circled his bed in helpless ritual, offering poultices and muttered prayers while watching a man rot before their eyes. Henry's last moments were grimly ironic. A monarch who had executed others for hesitation in their loyalty now lay with no one willing to speak the plain truth that his reign was ending. It was only when Archbishop Thomas Cranmer was summoned that words of finality were dared. The Archbishop urged him to place his trust in Christ, and Henry, too weak to speak, was said to have squeezed his hand in assent. But the horror did not end with his final breath. Death revealed what life had barely contained. His body, vast and diseased, resisted handling. No one wanted to approach the corpse. The task of preparing it fell to servants and embalmers who worked under both dread and nausea. They wrapped him in lead sheets, sealed him in layers of wood, and reinforced the coffin against the swelling gases they feared would rise from within. Even so, the body was too far gone. The king's flesh, stretched to breaking, threatened to split. Those who entered the chamber to view him reported sights so ghastly that they could not bear to linger. Had long styled himself as God's chosen ruler on earth, and in death, and his body bore witness instead to corruption, to the inevitability of decay that even the mightiest crown could not defy. And as his corpse left Whitehall for burial at Windsor, the horror grew, for no coffin could contain him. The journey would end in a spectacle so grotesque that it became legend the day England's most feared king burst from his grave in front of his subjects. The funeral procession of Henry VIII began with solemn grandeur. Buzzer beat, banners draped in black fluttered, and courtiers in mourning garb followed the hearse that bore England's most infamous king. Yet behind the ritual marched dread. Those who had seen the body knew what lay inside, not majesty, preserved, but corruption barely contained. The coffin, concealed in layers of lead and wood, was designed to restrain the gases of decay But Henry's swollen corpse defied restraint. As the procession moved toward Windsor, the pressure built, and somewhere along the road, the inevitable occurred. The coffin split, its lining burst open, and the rotting fluids of the king's body seeped onto the floor of the hearse and the road beneath. Chroniclers tell of a stench so overpowering that the procession halted. Servants scrambled with cloths and buckets, desperate to clean the leaking remains. And then came the detail that would turn disaster into nightmare dogs were seen licking at the royal fluids that spilled onto the ground. The king who had claimed divine right, who demanded worship and obedience, had become carrion in the mouths of strays. The horror did not end there. When the coffin finally reached Windsor, gravediggers struggled to lower it. The sheer weight of the lead, combined with the bloated remains, caused the earth to collapse beneath them. They had to widen the pit, reinforce it, and try again. Even in burial, Henry's bulk resisted rest, as though the ground itself rejected him. Rumors spread quickly. Some whispered of divine judgment, that God had marked Henry's death with corruption visible to all. Others believed his ghost haunted the chapel, For years afterward, strange sounds and foul smells were reported near his tomb. Priests dismissed it as superstition, but many suspected it was simply the gases of decomposition escaping slowly through the cracks, the coffin that burst, the dogs that licked, the grave that would not close. These became symbols of a reign that could not end cleanly. Henry had ruled through fear, excess, and suspicion, and in death, he left behind not peace, but a grotesque spectacle that haunted memory as surely as his executions and divorces. And so, when the earth finally settled over his remains, and England was left not with the image of a golden Renaissance prince, but with the memory of a tyrant undone by his own body. Yet the legacy of Henry VIII could not be buried so easily. His reign had scarred his kingdom and reshaped his faith, leaving behind a dynasty marked by fear and survival. The question remains, what is Henry's true legacy, his church, his heirs, or the monstrous cautionary tale of a king consumed by power and decay? Henry VIII is remembered in rhyme and portrayed the king with 6 wives, the monarch who broke with Rome, the broad figure in crimson robes painted by Hans Holbein. But behind the polished myths lies a truth far more unsettling. His reign was not only about church reform or dynastic politics, it was about the corrosion of a man and the contagion of his fear. He began as a Renaissance prince, athletic, scholarly, adored. He ended as a swollen tyrant, carried on contraptions, his body ulcerous and stinking, his mind haunted by suspicion. Each wife bore the weight of his obsessions. Catherine of Aragon, exiled; Anne Boleyn, executed; Jane Seymour, dead in childbirth; Anne of Cleves, humiliated but spared; Catherine Howard, beheaded in youth; Catherine Parr, surviving by caution alone. Their fates trace the arc of Henry's decline, each crown more fragile than the last. His court mirrored his body, lavish in outward show, rotting within. As eavesdropped through hidden passages, courtiers smiled while plotting against one another, and men died for crimes imagined in the king's dreams. Then his children were not safe, raised under the shadow of suspicion that would shape their reigns. Diana ruled with severity, Elizabeth with caution, Edward with fragility. Abgesi bore the scars of their father's paranoia, and in death, Henry remained monstrous. His coffin burst, his remains spilled onto the road, and the earth itself seemed reluctant to accept him. What greater symbol could there be of a reign defined by excess and corruption than a body that exploded under its own decay? Yet his impact cannot be denied, as in the Church of England, born of his desperation for a son, redefined faith in the realm, the centralization of power in the crown, reshaped politics for generations. His reign carved deep grooves in the path of English history, grooves that would guide the destinies of his children and the survival of the Tudor line. But what lesson lingers? That absolute power, unchecked by counsel or conscience, can turn a man into something less than human. That majesty, when twisted by paranoia and indulgence, becomes a prison rather than a crown. Henry VIII remains not merely a king of England, but a warning written in flesh and blood. The mightiest can fall victim to their own excess, and in doing so, drag an entire kingdom into the shadow of their decay. Centuries later, and we do not remember him as the golden prince he once was. We remember him as the monster his own body revealed, bloated, paranoid, cruel, a man who sought to rule as God's chosen, yet ended as carrion on the road to Windsor.